I spent far too long believing silence would protect the small territory I called independence. My name is Savannah, and the only thing I have ever treated as completely non-negotiable is the apartment I signed for on my own in Dallas. I did not inherit it, I did not share the paperwork, and I never pretended it was community property. It became the one controlled perimeter in a life that never offered me equal footing. Growing up, I watched every significant decision flow in a single direction. Attention, money, gifts, time, trips, none of those resources ever landed in my lap. I learned self-reliance not because it looked admirable on a resume, but because the alternative was emotional starvation. My role was to figure things out quietly. So when my family sold their house and converted the proceeds into months of world travel with my sister, I recognized the pattern. They did not ask whether I could join them or whether I even wanted to. I was not a factor in the planning because I never have been. I accepted the distance and focused on maintaining the one asset no one could confiscate with emotional pressure. When the money ran out, the tone changed. They did not return with questions. They returned with instructions. They treated my lease as an implied obligation. The final sentence from my father hit with full entitlement. You don't have the right to say no. My body made the decision faster than my mouth. I reached for my phone, called 911, then texted my attorney a 2-word memo. Get ready. If you want to hear exactly what unfolded after that call, stay with me, hit subscribe, and tell me whether you would have opened the door. I did not wake up one morning and suddenly realize that my place in the family operated under a silent quota system because the imbalance had been forming for years in a way that looked natural to everyone except the person carrying the cost. The first time I understood how expectations were allocated happened in school, when classes were expensive and extracurricular programs demanded fees, which meant I worked part-time to cover what tuition or textbooks did not, while my mother Linda insisted that every cent spent on education should be viewed as a family investment in my sister Veronica, rather than a shared priority. Once that pattern settled into place, Veronica became the singular benchmark for success or disappointment, and I learned how to arrange my schedule around employment rather than hobbies, since I did not want conversations about invoices to turn into lectures about gratitude. As I aged, it became obvious that Linda was never motivated by curiosity about my workload or academic pressure, because her primary concern involved maintaining a moral authority that let her speak about duty, sacrifice, and obedience, without ever confronting whether those standards applied evenly. She preferred instructing me to give back, rather than asking if there was anything left to give, and she used language that made refusal sound like a character defect. A simple sentence such as, "I cannot cover," that turned into an indictment about selfishness, and any hesitation triggered a speech about how loyalty should override discomfort. Over time, morality became a form of accounting for her, and every dollar I kept for rent became a symbol of rebellion rather than a practical approach to survival. My father Carl did not correct Linda or question her delivery. Instead, he perfected a muted expression that looked supportive enough to satisfy her without offering any conflicting opinion, which signaled to me that silence was a method of confirming the hierarchy rather than neutral observation. If he did not challenge her, then I could not expect to challenge the structure they shared, which meant every attempt at conversation left me repeating information into a void. That dynamic made it pointless to chase negotiation, so I streamlined my responses into 2 strategies: either pay what I could and move forward, or decline and accept the accusation that followed. Meanwhile, Veronica learned early that experience delivered status, and she positioned herself as someone who deserved the thrill of expansion. Whether she traveled for concerts, internships, or social events, Linda described it as exploration development or necessary exposure, and every boundary became a runway for Veronica to demonstrate that she understood life better. I heard her dismiss practicality with one sentence: "If you cannot afford joy, you do not deserve it." That idea did not come from economics. It came from entitlement, yet No one corrected her because Carl preferred harmony and Linda preferred admiration. I adjusted in the only direction available. I worked more hours and removed emotional interpretation from the act of handling money, so bills became checkpoints rather than statements about identity. I did not ask for coverage cosigners or parental endorsement because dependence would have transformed into leverage the moment Linda needed evidence that I owed her something. I avoided loans that could be weaponized later, and I accepted that building credit required consistency rather than applause. The outcome was not glamorous, but it was stable, and stability gave me jurisdiction over a life that no one else funded. When conversations escalated inside that household, I reduced emotional output because the goal was not to win a debate. The goal was to protect autonomy. I did not chase approval or request recognition, since either response could be repurposed to prove that my restraint was arrogance. Instead, I concentrated on legal clarity by monitoring what belonged to me, documenting what I paid, and refusing to perform loyalty like a stage routine designed for people who wanted evidence of devotion rather than genuine adult participation. My priority was to maintain a distance between my finances and their expectations, because proximity would have allowed anyone to claim that personal resources were family resources. That approach became a philosophy rather than a habit. If a request could be held against me later, I stepped away. If a conversation required an apology to maintain access, I disengaged. If silence prevented escalation, I embraced it, because a boundary that cannot be enforced becomes theater, and I did not want to live inside a script written by people who believed obligation outranked consent. 2 months before the trip, everything became official in a way I never expected to witness. I arrived at my apartment in Dallas after work and saw a missed call from Mom that did not include any context or request for a callback. When I returned the call, she answered with a polished tone and informed me that she and Dad had signed the final paperwork to sell the house. There was no hesitation in her delivery. She spoke as if this decision had been developing through open conversations that involved every member of our family. It took me several seconds to understand that the transaction was complete and that they no longer had a place to live. I asked whether they were downsizing in Dallas or planning to relocate to another neighborhood. Mom laughed lightly and explained that downsizing was a mindset for people who lacked ambition. She told me that she and Dad were about to start life on the road and that Veronica would join them because she understood experience culture and the thrill of motion. I listened without responding because I wanted to hear whether any part of this decision included a question for me. I never heard one. Dad entered the call only to remark that everything had gone smoothly and that the buyer wanted to close quickly. He did not offer details about timelines or logistics. He did not ask whether I wanted to keep furniture or documents. He did not mention whether they required temporary housing. His silence functioned like a confirmation that my participation was unnecessary. I asked when they had decided to sell. Veronica interrupted and said that not everyone wanted to live small in Dallas. She spoke with a tone that suggested my life was a cramped holding pattern, while theirs would become a ribbon of prestige across continents. I asked whether she expected me to congratulate them. Veronica replied that people either celebrated freedom or stayed resentful. Mom referred to the sale as freedom we earned, not freedom we negotiated. She treated every dollar from the buyer as a stored validation of their sacrifices as parents. The more she talked, the more I understood that this transaction was a ceremony of self-praise rather than a practical reset. She did not mention storage units. She did not acknowledge the existence of childhood belongings. She did not ask where I fit into the family structure now that the physical foundation was gone. Dad closed the conversation by saying they planned to be in Barcelona 3 days after they left Dallas. That timeline indicated that they had been planning everything privately. I recognized how cleanly they had removed me from the decision-making perimeter. There was no request for opinion. There was no check-in regarding emotional impact. They wanted a life that rewarded thrill without accountability. I ended the call and sat with the clarity that our family defined worth by who remained closest to the channel of money. The person who traveled was valued. The person who stayed still became negligible. The transaction had a secondary meaning for me. It told me that the family unit was now built around two travelers and a companion who validated them. In the following weeks, my phone history shifted. Messages from Mom contained photos of airport lounges and drinks. Messages from Veronica displayed curated confidence and commentary about how pressure could not touch her. Dad forwarded short logistical notes about bank cards and international phone plans, but never directed a personal statement toward me. Communication became a one-way broadcast in which they celebrated themselves. They did not ask where I stood during holidays. They did not ask whether I needed support. They did not ask about work. Their silence was not incidental, it was strategic. I responded by maintaining distance because nothing constructive could be gained from seeking emotional space in people who had demonstrated selective recognition. By the time they boarded the flight for their first destination, I already understood the message: I was not included. I was not expected. I was not relevant to the new structure they were building. They did not leave a home. They erased any place where I could belong. 3 months later, they came back broke, and the return carried an expectation rather than a greeting because there was no acknowledgement of the months they spent celebrating themselves. I learned they were back in Texas because Mom sent a message that did not ask where I stood emotionally or financially. She informed me that she wanted to visit my apartment after work because she needed to discuss what she called a redistribution of stability. Her tone signaled that she believed the outcome had already been set. Mom entered with the certainty of someone who believes blood outranks autonomy, and she began speaking before I could sit or prepare. She said that daughters who stand alone inside private space are obligated to extend that space when parents require shelter. She did not present her needs as a request. She framed them as the natural order of family loyalty. When she said that family shares stability, she did not blink or hesitate, as if silence from me would transform her premise into functional law. I watched her posture rather than her words, because she behaved like someone who had decided that access to my apartment was a birthright. She said that I had no grounds to maintain exclusivity over something built with salary and rent because family connections dilute individuality. She ignored the fact that I paid every bill without assistance. I waited for her to acknowledge the financial collapse that forced her return, but she refused to mention depletion or accountability. Her arguments had nothing to do with logistics. They focused entirely on hierarchy. Mom adjusted her approach by layering a moral vocabulary over the financial problem. She said that parents gave life and therefore children repay life by absorbing inconvenience. She accused refusal of violating the emotional contract between generations. She spoke with an intensity that made it clear she considered disagreement an infraction against a sacred code, which suggested that she intended to convert their instability into my obligation. Dad sat across from us without touching the subject of money. He did not apologize for the speed at which their funds evaporated. He did not correct Mom or soften her directives. The silence he maintained granted Mom the illusion of legal authority, because if he did not challenge her, then she could imagine consensus. The longer he avoided speaking, the more she accelerated her sense of entitlement, and the room shifted into something that resembled a negotiation in name only. Veronica positioned herself as the mediator, but the performance lacked sincerity. She sent a message that encouraged me to stay flexible because harmony is cheaper than conflict. The wording suggested that I should cooperate before matters became messy. She never referred to the exclusion that preceded the trip, and she never acknowledged the convenience of her timing. The same people who dismissed my place in the family structure were now asking that I offer the only asset I controlled without hesitation. Veronica did not pretend she needed shelter. She pretended that compliance would prove maturity. I answered with a refusal that did not contain apology or narrative. I told Mom that explanations were unnecessary because property rights do not require theatrical justification. Her reaction indicated that she had expected bargaining or guilt. Instead, she encountered neutrality. She pressed again for emotional reasoning, and I explained that emotional contracts cannot override legal boundaries. The more she escalated, the calmer I became, which unsettled her sense of leverage. Mom attempted a final angle by claiming that I owed them presents during hardship, and she described compliance as the only acceptable response for a decent daughter. I reminded her that financial depletion does not grant automatic access to private housing. She tried to reinterpret my stance as abandonment. I interpreted her position as a transaction disguised as parental righteousness. Dad finally spoke, but he did not address responsibility. He said that a united family does not fragment itself over walls and doors, and that the moment called for generosity rather than scrutiny. I listened with patience because his statement confirmed that they considered my apartment a resource rather than a home. They returned not to rejoin a family unit or rebuild trust. They returned to claim a commodity they did not earn. I walked them to the hallway and made it clear that nothing in my life required redistribution. I closed the door not as an act of hostility, but as a confirmation that boundaries exist even when relatives refuse to recognize them. 1 month later, they were back in Dallas, and they manifested that return through a calculated visit rather than a respectful check-in, which meant the situation moved from financial pressure into physical expectation. I arrived home after work, used my key card at the garage gate, and saw Mom and Dad waiting near the building's front vestibule. They did not appear disoriented or embarrassed. They acted like people who believed they had already secured permission. Veronica positioned herself beside Mom, and her presence confirmed that this was not a spontaneous moment of uncertainty. It was a tactical demonstration. Mom greeted me as if the outcome had been negotiated off stage, and she said they brought luggage because it made little sense to delay integration into what she called our next period of stability. She explained that the trip ended earlier than planned because travel teaches discipline, and she believed the disciplined choice involved consolidating family resources. There was no mention of financial miscalculations. The narrative shifted into moral vocabulary. Dad stopped performing politeness. He looked at the front entrance as if it were already available for his keycard. He said the sentence without hesitation or apology. He said, "You do not have the right to say no." He did not approach it as an emotional plea. He delivered it like a boundary ruling. His tone implied that my refusal would constitute a violation of a family agreement, even though no such agreement existed. That sentence exposed the underlying logic. In his mind, the apartment did not belong to the person whose name appeared on the lease. It belonged to a collective identity that could claim space without negotiation. Dad spoke as if legal occupancy automatically bowed to bloodline. He also delivered the statement before Veronica opened her mouth, which made his position explicit. This was a directive rather than a request. Veronica leaned into the message with a secondary strategy. She used the vocabulary of unity and teamwork. She said that we are family, and she suggested that disagreement signaled selfishness. She said people who fixate on individual rights lose sight of real loyalty. She did not address dollars or logistics. She positioned morality as the only metric. She did not acknowledge distance created by years of exclusion. She treated the word family as leverage rather than relationship. Mom escalated by attributing emotional responsibility. She said that children protect parents during setbacks. She said that refusal demonstrates an absence of gratitude. She said I needed to demonstrate maturity by housing them without debate. Her argument did not address rent contracts, tenant rights, or building policies. She spoke in absolutes because absolutes provide insulation for those who want to avoid accountability. I did not engage emotionally. I observed the strategy. They attempted to convert inconvenience into a legal inevitability. They pretended that inconvenient logistics collapse under the weight of obligation. They also behaved as if my calm tone represented weakness rather than restraint. I responded by saying the word no without embellishment. I did not supply an explanation because explanation feeds entitlement. Silence creates a record. Dad repeated his line with slower cadence. He said, "You do not have the right to say no," and he stared at the entrance again. He attempted to activate intimidation through volume rather than content. The repetition did not create authority. It created documentation. Repetition becomes evidence of intent. I evaluated the environment. Residential buildings track guest access. Private units cannot house unauthorized long-term occupants without notifying management. Attempts to force access constitute trespass. Attempts to physically overwhelm refusal create additional liability. I did not mention statutes. I simply measured risk. They began lifting luggage. The gesture was designed to shorten negotiation. If luggage crosses a threshold, negotiation ends and occupancy begins. Occupancy grants leverage. Leveraged occupants become difficult to remove without eviction hearings. They did not understand those procedures, but they understood momentum. I stepped between the entrance sensor and their luggage. I stated that the door would remain shut. I said that no one would enter my apartment without consent. I informed them that continued pressure would create a need for building intervention. The word intervention cooled the temperature because consequences rearrange confidence. Mom tried one final tactic. She said they sacrificed for me, and she asked whether I planned to repay them through exclusion. She reframed my sentence as betrayal. I reframed her sentence as entitlement. Veronica signaled impatience and Dad withheld eye contact. I did not treat their frustration as crisis. I treated it as evidence. I held my ground, waited for the elevator traffic to resume, and watched their confidence fade when physical entry did not occur. That night, I opened my laptop and reviewed occupancy laws because preparation provides certainty, and certainty eliminates coercion. 1 week later, I came home from a short work trip, and the shift in atmosphere did not carry emotional spectacle or sentimental reconciliation. It carried the unmistakable texture of intrusion. I unlocked the door to the 7th-floor hallway, walked toward my unit, and saw a piece of rolling luggage stationed directly beside my threshold. There was no delivery tag. It was positioned like a placeholder for occupancy rather than travel. The hallway camera above my doorway blinked at regular intervals, which meant the motion sensor had already registered activity during my absence. I inserted my key, opened the door, and registered an unfamiliar arrangement of shoes near the entry rug. The apartment carried scents that did not belong to my routine. I scanned the living area and saw blankets folded on the edge of the sofa, plastic containers on the counter, and a stack of folded shirts balanced on a chair that never served that function. I did not hear conversation, laughter, or movement. They were absent, but their belongings claimed presence. Mom must have waited for my building's automated system to recycle temporary access codes for vendors because my lease did not authorize secondary fobs. I never submitted documents for additional residents. Someone entered by circumventing authorization rather than requesting it. That detail revealed intent. The act depended on quiet execution, not permission. Dad's jacket hung from a dining chair. Veronica's tote bag rested on an ottoman. A charger cable extended from an outlet to a phone that remained powered but unattended. These objects performed a message. The apartment belonged to the person who showed up and initiated daily use. In their minds, physical placement outranked contractual language. I did not shout. I did not summon theatrical outrage. I took out my phone, activated the timestamp feature, and photographed each cluster of belongings without commentary. I recorded the entryway, the living room perimeter, the countertops, the placement of the suitcase, and the location of the tote bag. Documentation prevents narrative distortion. I checked the building access history on my tenant portal. 2 entries registered during my absence. Both occurred late morning on separate days. Someone used a generic guest code assigned by management to short-term maintenance access. That code requires a building representative to escort the visitor. Either escort did not occur or the visitor exceeded authorized scope. Neither interpretation favors casual forgiveness. I stood near the entry, waited for the elevator to cycle, and heard a metallic click at the end of the hallway. Lucas, the neighbor who occupies the corner unit, stepped forward with his mail. I introduced him previously at a holiday event, so our rapport carried civility rather than closeness. I said hello, and he said he assumed I had already returned because he saw my family enter the apartment twice that week. He said they told him we already talked about this. He did not interpret it as a crime or an emergency, but he recognized that language as a claim of consent. I did not correct him with emotion. I asked him whether he remembered the approximate time frame of their comings and goings. He provided the hours. He also noted that Mom asked him which direction led to the trash chute, which implied she intended to establish ordinary household rhythms rather than brief visitation. That detail mattered more than outrage because it suggested occupancy. I thanked Lucas without embellishment. I returned to my apartment and recorded a voice memo summarizing the facts. I did not mention insults, morality, or family history. Facts create leverage because facts survive scrutiny. I walked to the closet and saw 2 suitcases stacked behind my vacuum. The items were not placed for convenience. They were positioned for storage. Long-term placement in private closets communicates entitlement. The suitcase near the entrance indicated arrival. The suitcase near my vacuum indicated possession. I sat at the dining table, opened my laptop, and reviewed local statutes regarding unauthorized residency and building access. The information did not serve retaliation. It served clarity. The law recognizes physical entry without consent as an action that can escalate into claims of residency if the occupant remains for an extended period. Removal becomes more complicated if someone sleeps inside the residence. I did not wait for that threshold. I powered down the laptop, returned to the table, and removed every item that did not belong to me. I did not place the belongings outside the unit because abandonment creates unnecessary litigation. I gathered the items near the entrance in a visible cluster. I did not prepare a note. Silence communicates a refusal to validate presumptions. I did not call Mom, Dad, or Veronica. I prepared evidence for a different audience. 2 weeks later, I stopped asking for space because requests lose significance when someone interprets access as a natural extension of blood rather than a contractual boundary. I sat at my dining table before sunrise and reviewed the time-stamped photographs I captured after my work trip. The items documented possession rather than visitation. They established continuity of use. They created a foundation for legal interpretation. I picked up my phone, dialed 911, and reported an unauthorized residential entry. My voice remained steady because I was not searching for emotional recognition. I needed a record. When the officers arrived, I opened the door and stated that I occupied the unit under a written lease, that no secondary resident authorization existed in the building portal, and that certain individuals entered during my absence by using an access credential that did not originate from me. The officers requested identification, verified my lease information, and asked whether the subjects were still inside. I explained that the belongings remained in the apartment, but the individuals had not returned that morning. The officer took notes, confirmed that tenants in Texas hold exclusive possession rights under a lease contract, and classified the matter as a potential trespass subject to further investigation. He asked whether I wanted an official report. I said yes. The officers stepped into the living area, reviewed the belongings arranged on the ottoman, inspected the closets, and asked whether I recognized each item. I identified items connected to Mom, Dad, and Veronica by brand and placement. The officer asked whether anyone held a key. I said no. He clarified that continued unauthorized access could trigger removal, especially if the building code required resident registration. He left after assigning a report number. Once the apartment returned to silence, I opened my laptop and typed a concise message to my attorney, Grant, who handled a previous employment contract negotiation. I explained that I needed written correspondence addressed to Mom, Dad, and Veronica, ordering them to cease unauthorized entry into a leased residence and instructing them not to access the building common areas or the unit without documented consent. I attached photographs, timestamps, the police report number, and the building access history that showed 2 guest code entries. Grant responded with a 10-minute turnaround speed that communicated professional familiarity with the escalation rather than personal investment. He said he would draft a written warning referencing Texas Penal Code language and distribute it through email to eliminate any claim of uncertainty. After sending the request, I scheduled a meeting with the property manager, Diane. When I sat in her office, she opened the building guidelines and pointed to the guest residency section. She explained that any individual who sleeps in a unit, stores belongings for extended periods, or enters multiple times within a 30-day window must register as a temporary resident. Registration requires identity verification, a background check, and signature on the building code of conduct. Without compliance, security personnel can remove the individual from the property. Diane did not lecture. She read verbatim. Her tone reflected policy rather than moral stance. I asked whether the building provided the guest code that appeared in my access history. She reviewed the security log and said a maintenance supervisor escorted 2 individuals toward my floor. If those individuals bypassed supervision, the escort requirement failed and building security would investigate. Diane recommended resetting my access code and updating my digital key. I agreed. I returned to my apartment, opened the resident portal, and changed every credential. I activated the log feature that tracks entry attempts at 15-minute intervals. I adjusted elevator permissions so no one could reach my floor without a registered code. I printed the building rule about unauthorized residency and placed it near the laptop for reference. The rules did not intimidate me. They created structure. Grant's draft arrived before noon. The first paragraph identified the residence, the leaseholder, the building address, and the legal boundary of exclusive possession. The second paragraph stated that unauthorized entry constituted a violation subject to criminal penalty. The third paragraph demanded immediate cessation of all entry, direct or indirect, and forbade Mom, Dad, and Veronica from contacting building personnel to request access. Grant ended the letter by reserving rights for civil action. The letter did not rely on emotion. It relied on consequence. I forwarded the document to Diane so she could file it in the building records. She acknowledged receipt and said she would notify the HOA board because prolonged unauthorized presence can trigger fines against a unit. That comment reflected an administrative perspective rather than sympathy. The building treated occupancy as liability. I saved every file in a folder labeled Residency Evidence. I dated the cover page. I was finished explaining access. I maintain a life organized by documented rights rather than open-ended negotiations, and I no longer respond to messages sent by Mom, Dad, or Veronica because communication invites reinterpretation of limits. My phone shows unread notifications, yet silence functions as a contractual wall. I do not soften boundaries by issuing explanations, and I do not construct a narrative about emotional injury. I make the distinction between legal responsibility and involuntary caretaking. It does not require an apology. Mom and Dad confront the direct result of liquidating their house, which removed every long-term anchor they possessed. They rotate through motels located near highway access points because monthly senior rentals require proof of income identification and adherence to community rules. Travel advertisements never described the cost structure of housing instability, and the fantasy of a roaming lifestyle dissolves when every night demands payment before sleep. I do not track the sequence of their lodging changes. I do not inquire about comfort or logistics. My absence represents a conclusion rather than leverage. Veronica loses a channel of extraction because the apartment cannot serve as housing storage or collateral for manipulation. She searches for income rather than distribution, which forces a recognition that adulthood in the United States depends on solvency, credit, and autonomous decision-making. She cannot present herself as moral authority when the capacity to pay her own expenses becomes the test. She cannot construct a family tribunal because I decline to attend. A tribunal without participation becomes a monologue, and a monologue carries no behavioral power. I do not prepare statements about betrayal. I do not translate private choices into psychological narratives. I secure my residential space by maintaining updated access logs, stored correspondence from my attorney electronic lease addenda, and verification that no unauthorized key fob remains active. My building treated the problem as a matter of compliance, so I follow the same model. A rule either applies or dissolves, and I am not interested in dissolution. Work shifts into a predictable cycle because no domestic interference interrupts planning. Meetings conclude without the distraction of pending conflicts, and my performance evaluations reflect consistent concentration. I sleep without waiting for unannounced entry, and my body responds to continuity rather than alarm. Health becomes measurable rather than theoretical. It appears in the absence of vigilance. I do not congratulate myself for resilience. Resilience always demanded a threat. Stability requires none. Personal time belongs to me rather than to an endless petition for empathy. I exercise at regular intervals, eat meals without glancing toward the door, and sit near the window without wondering whether someone will claim the seat by invoking kinship. A boundary ceases to feel dramatic when it becomes ordinary. Ordinary conduct builds protection. Protection creates longevity. I do not alter my position because relatives experience discomfort. That discomfort came from choices made without calculation. They treated housing as entertainment, and entertainment does not sustain aging bodies. They framed obligation as destiny, and destiny cannot override statute. They attempted to reassign my apartment to themselves, and the attempt failed. Failure carries neither tragedy nor vindication. It simply produces consequence. Mom continues to reference love when she contacts extended relatives. Veronica emphasizes sacrifice when she speaks to anyone who will listen. Dad remains quiet because silence once operated as intimidation. Silence now operates as absence of influence. None of these strategies affect the direction of my life. They represent commentary rather than authority. I do not schedule family meetings. I do not sit for negotiations. I do not reevaluate. My separation holds. It holds because it is legal. It holds because I choose it. It holds because nothing requires revision. Boundaries are not emotional performances. They are enforceable structures that convert private preference into recognizable legal status. A parent's sacrifice does not create perpetual ownership, and adulthood does not assign debt to the most functional relative. If someone demands access to your housing, ask whether law or sentiment is speaking. Legality clarifies responsibility, and clarity prevents exploitation. Protect your residence, protect your records, and stop treating family obligation as divine instruction. Thank you for reading and for offering space where personal boundaries can be discussed without theatrics or moral inflation. If this account reminds you of situations where obligation replaced choice, feel free to share perspectives or questions. Dialogue can support autonomy when it remains grounded in consent rather than pressure. Your time matters, and your interpretation stands on equal footing with mine.